Hey everyone, my name is Christy. Welcome to my corner. Today we are in my baking corner and I am here with a pumpkin and the National Cookbook by Hannah Mary Bouvier Peterson, and this edition was published in 1856. And what this means is that I'm doing another episode of historical baking. I've had a lot of new subscribers lately, so thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate you, coming along for the ride. For those of you who are coming back, thanks so much for your support. I really appreciate it. I know I say this all the time, but this has been a really positive thing in my life, and I appreciate your support and your comments and your likes and all that kind of stuff. And if you're watching this and not subscribed, my channel is about embroidery and baking and other handcrafts and also history. I'm a history professor, and so I try to put some history into a lot of the things that I do, including, in this case, baking. So I got this pumpkin from my local farm. I participate in a CSA, a community supported agriculture program with a local farm, and basically I pay up front an amount of money, and then each week I go and I pick up a bag of produce. And at one point I got this pumpkin and I didn't know what to do with it because I've never actually worked with a pumpkin before. I've done squashes, but never a pumpkin, which I know is a squash, but it's a different kind of squash. So I thought, Hannah probably knows what to do with a pumpkin. So I looked in the National Cookbook to see what kind of pumpkin recipes there were, and there were 3 pumpkin recipes. One of them was how to dry pumpkin in order to use it, like store it for later. I'm not going to do that. Then there were 2 versions of pumpkin pudding, and essentially this is just pumpkin pie. And I've made pumpkin pie before, but I've never made pumpkin pie with a whole pumpkin, which seems kind of strange, really, because pumpkins are really cheap and I should be using pumpkins more. So this is kind of my exploration into using pumpkins as opposed to canned pumpkins to make pumpkin pie. And her pumpkin pudding, there are 2 versions, like I said, is really just regular pumpkin pie with the addition of brandy. The 2 versions are very similar. They both include butter, sugar, eggs, brandy, cinnamon, nutmeg, and pumpkin. But the second version also includes a cup of cream. And I think I'm going to do that version because cream makes everything taste better. Pumpkin pudding number 2 is what I'm going to be doing. And I'll post a picture of that right here. And it has 8 eggs, a pint of stewed pumpkin, a 1/4 pound of butter, a 1/4 pound of sugar, 2 tablespoons of brandy, a cup of cream, a teaspoon of cinnamon, and a teaspoon of nutmeg. And the pumpkin is supposed to be stewed pumpkin. So basically that's what I have to do first. And she does not have a recipe for stewed pumpkin, but her directions are stew the pumpkin in very little water, mash it very fine, add the butter, and stand it away to cool. So I am going to chop up and clean up this pumpkin and skin it, take out the outer shell, because apparently you can't eat that, I think. At least that's what the internet tells me. If I'm wrong, please correct me, and it'll be much easier next time I do it. And then I'll record that. I'll put you up sort of above so you'll be able to see when I cut that up. And I'm going to then stew it and add the butter and let it cool. So I think this is basically going to be an all-day event, and I will bring you along for a ride. So if you are interested in pumpkin pudding from 1856 Philadelphia, please keep watching. And I think in my voiceovers, because there's going to be lots of chopping and stuff, I will explore the new wife's guide, the new housewives guide. So basically one of her other books is a household guide for young wives, and it has all sorts of really interesting household recipes at the end of it, because in the 1860s you couldn't just go to the store and buy all the cleaners that you needed. In some cases you had to make them yourself, and she gives directions on how to do that, and it's really interesting. So I think that I'll explore that. Anyway, if you're interested in all of that stuff, please stick with me and we will hopefully end up with some pumpkin pudding. I'm back to Hannah Mary Bouvier Peterson's Young Wife's Cookbook, and something that I think many of us can relate to are Hannah's views on leftovers. In her preface, she gave her reasons for writing this book and also some guidance on how to use it and what was included in it. And in the first paragraph of the preface, she had this to say about leftovers. In addition to recipes like normal recipes, she says, quote,
preparing good and tempting dishes from cold meats, vegetables, and puddings, which may be served with all the warmth and appetizing appearance of the original dish, unquote. So she has this idea that normal families eat the same thing multiple days in a row. And then, like the good saleswoman she was, she tells us that her book is singular and revolutionary in this regard. She says, quote, "Every housekeeper must be aware that no previous book upon cooking has been given containing satisfactory information on this point. That this subject is important will be recognized when we think that there are none but the families and houses of the wealthiest who do not, as a general rule, have roasts as well as other eatables sent to the table twice and even thrice." I love that she recognizes that not everyone gets a fresh cooked meal every day, and in fact points out that only the very wealthy are able to do that. But it doesn't mean that the leftovers should be unappealing or unappetizing. And for me, this gives a glimpse into the lives of normal women and their normal domestic duties. It's one of the reasons that cookbooks are so fascinating and also such important sources for history. Leaving our discussion of leftovers, something that I am very interested in as a women's historian are the expected behaviors that women had to basically fit themselves into in order to be a part of respectable society. And this is something I talk a lot about in my classes, and I think Hannah's views on the expectations for a new housewife are very interesting. In the German cake historical baking video that I will link to here, I gave some examples of anecdotes and moral exempla that she provided throughout the book, and I'll give more of those in this video later. But first, I want to look more closely at her preface because she has some revolutionary ideas about the expectations of women mixed with more traditional ones. Despite her focus on domestic duties, she definitely believed in the inherent intelligence of women, which was not universally acknowledged. And this is unsurprising as she was a prolific scientific author as well as a cookbook author, which I talked about in earlier episodes of Historical Baking, which I will link to here. I think I discussed this part of the preface in a previous video, but I want to revisit it because it's relevant to this discussion. Hannah saw herself as a modern and enlightened woman, and believed that women needed the chance to cultivate their minds. So to this end, she wrote, quote, "Though it is not desirable in this enlightened age that ladies should, like their great-grandmothers, devote themselves exclusively to household duties, yet a thorough knowledge of domestic management is not incompatible with the cultivation of the mind. On the contrary, this knowledge encourages them to all the studies and pursuits which tend to make home happy. The useful instruction so necessary to attain this great aim of life is rarely supplied at school or at home to girls at that early age when the mind is ductile and the frame active, and consequently, in mature years, the attempt to acquire new habits is frequently irksome and mortifying." So for Hannah, a woman who took knowledge seriously was able to learn new things as she got older and avoid embarrassment. She also believed that a woman's learning shouldn't be for herself alone, but instead should be used to add to the comfort of her husband and children. I want to end this section by showing Hannah's views on this compatibility of domestic knowledge with the, quote, cultivation of the mind. She wrote, "Good sense, good humor, and good principles are the female spells that diffuse cheerfulness and peace around the hearth of the poor as well as the rich man. Intellectual attainments and brilliant accomplishments are agreeable fireside companions, but any woman, if she earnestly determines to do her duty faithfully and pleasantly, may make her humble fireside as happy to her husband, children, and friends as the brilliant drawing room. In the management of a household, as well as in the regulation of the human mind, it is attention to the smaller daily duties which forms the sum of usefulness and happiness." I find this part fascinating because Hannah seems to expect young housewives to be active participants in conversations with their husbands. The goal was a happy household, but to get to that goal, women needed knowledge and understanding. I want to mention another author who discussed the importance of education 60 years earlier. Mary Wollstonecraft, in her Vindication of the Rights of Women, spent a lot of pages discussing how important it was for women to be educated. Education was the key to women's happiness and usefulness, and she too believed in the fundamental intelligence of women.
So I'm stewing the pumpkin, and I put too much water in. Apparently, a little bit of water is not a cup. But
it'll cook down and it'll be fine.
Okay, so I have a pumpkin puree here that I stewed. I stewed the pumpkin as per the directions, and I added in the stick of butter, which is 113 grams of butter. So the recipe calls for a pint of pumpkin puree with that stick of butter. I just wanted to make sure I use the whole pumpkin, and so it's a little bit more than a pint. It's probably about 2.5 cups of pumpkin puree with that butter. So it came out to be altogether 900 grams with the stick of butter and the pumpkin puree. So I have adjusted my measurements accordingly just to make sure I have enough eggs to set it and enough cream and all that kind of stuff. So basically this calls for 8 eggs, which is 400-ish grams of eggs, 1 pint of stewed pumpkin, 1/4 pound of butter, which is a stick of butter or 113 grams of butter, 1/4 pound of sugar, which is 113 grams of sugar, or roughly 1/2 cup, maybe, something like that. And then it also calls for a tablespoon of brandy, a teacup full of cream, and I have a little less than a cup of cream here, which I thought would be, a teacup is usually about 5 ounces, I think. And so this is a little bit more than a teacup, but I have more stuff, so that makes sense. 1 teaspoon of cinnamon and 1 teaspoon of nutmeg. It says stew the pumpkin in very little water. I use too much water, which you've already seen. Mash it very fine, add the butter, and stand it away to cool. So I have done that step, and so what I have now is a nice pumpkin puree with butter. Then beat the eggs, and when the pumpkin is cool, add them and the other ingredients. So I have 10 eggs in here because I have more pumpkin than it calls for in the recipe. So I decided to do about 500 grams of eggs as opposed to 400 grams of eggs, and that was roughly 10 of my eggs that I have. So I'm going to add this in, mix it all around, and then add all the other ingredients as well. My oven is currently preheating to 350 because it says to bake in a moderately hot oven, which has been historically, in this whole experimental stuff, 350 or 180 for those of you who do Celsius. And this is basically a pumpkin pie. It says to line your pie plates with paste, which is pastry, right? Pie crust. Pour in the pumpkin and bake in a moderately hot oven. I'm not going to use pie crust. I just want this to be the pumpkin filling. And so what I have is I just got this beautiful baking tray, baking casserole dish. So I'm gonna put it in this and take this on its first adventure in the oven. So let's pour the eggs in, pour the other ingredients in. I have my seasonings here. Oh, it also has about 1/2 teaspoon of salt in it because the recipe doesn't call for salt because historically the butter would have been salted. So I'm going to stand up and start mixing things. Oh, and you will have probably noticed that I am wearing a different shirt than I was wearing in my introduction. I recorded that introduction 3 weeks ago. After I recorded that introduction, I went and walked the dog and I twisted my ankle and I was having trouble standing that day. So I never finished my pumpkin pudding that day. And then I just got really busy and I wasn't able to finish it. So it's 3 weeks later and I'm finishing my pumpkin pudding. Luckily, pumpkins last for like ever. So my pumpkin was perfectly fine and we're gonna keep going with the mixing of the pumpkin pudding.
I want to wrap up my discussion of the Young Wife's Cookbook this week with some more of Hannah's educational anecdotes and a recipe for driving away mosquitoes, because I live in Mississippi and apparently I am delicious to southern mosquitoes. One of my favorite anecdotes is a conversation between a woman and her husband, which I think fits well into my theme for this video. Hannah writes, "Is a man and his wife one?" asked the wife of a man in a state of stupefaction as she was holding his aching head in both hands. "Yes, I suppose so," was the reply. "Well, then," said she, "I came home very drunk last night, and I ought to be ashamed of myself." Unquote. So I find this hilarious, and this is very telling of the role that women were supposed to play in the household. So she is kind of, this wife is kind of the moral guidance of the household, of the husband, but also supporting him in his bad decisions. And so I kind of love that. Another anecdote is a recipe for peace soup. For every angry word that's uttered against you, put in one mild one. This will be found to be a very useful soup in families troubled with irritable tempers. This tells us once again that it is the job of the young housewife to keep the peace and make the household a happy place for everyone. And one of the ways to do that is to not rise to the bait of angry words. And finally, let's get rid of those mosquitoes. Hannah recommends camphor, and she wrote, "A camphor bag hung up in an open casement will prove an effectual barrier to their entrance. Camphorated spirits applied as perfume to the face and hands will prove an effectual preventative, but when bitten by them, aromatic vinegar is the best antidote." So there you go. That's how you get rid of, prevent, and help with itchy mosquito bites.
Here you can see what the batter, or I guess custard, looks like. It's essentially a custard, right? This is what the custard looks like. I'm going to pour it into my casserole dish and then pop it in the oven for, I'm going to start with 30 minutes. So I just showed you what the mixture looks like. It's pretty light, but I think that's because of the cream that I added. It is essentially a pumpkin custard. That's what pumpkin pie is. So I'm going to pour it into my gorgeous dish and pop it in the oven for, what, 30 minutes I said? Yeah, 30 minutes I'll try and see what it looks like in 30 minutes. And if I need more time, I'll give it more time. And I'll report back how long it took in the end. So let's pour this in gently. That is probably as high as I want it to be. So I'm gonna go get some ramekins and make a couple small ones. Luckily, I have 2 clean ramekins. I use ramekins for my excess bread pudding from the other video, which I will link to over here, I think it is. I made the bread pudding this morning and I added cinnamon and apple to it. I forgot to add vanilla. It would have been really good with vanilla, I think. So, and I will put this in the oven for 30 minutes, check on it, and let it bake until it's done. And I will see you when it's all over. Well, we are cooked and out of the oven, but it's still warm. And those of you who have baked pumpkin pies before probably heard me say 30 minutes in the oven and I'll check on it, and started laughing because by 30 minutes it was still liquid. This took an hour and 20 minutes. This took 80 minutes in the oven. Mostly because it's just so much filling. Like, this is probably twice the amount of filling you would put in a pumpkin pie. I just wanted to use the whole pumpkin because I knew that if I didn't use the pumpkin right now, it was never going to get used. So I used the whole pumpkin. The ramekins came out at about 50 minutes and they were, I think, slightly overcooked. So they were a bit eggier than I like. I don't know if this is going to be eggier than I like. This is much less cooked, and I'll put a picture from the top right here so you can see what that looks like. The split down the middle is actually, I use a butter knife or a kitchen knife to check for doneness. So this is just like that expanded, unfortunately. So it's not beautiful, but I'm sure it'll be delicious. And even slightly overcooked, the ramekin pumpkin puddings were delicious, just so you know. So it's Saturday today. I'm posting this on Tuesday. So if we try this in the meantime, before I post it and before I edit this video, and something is wrong with it, I will put that in kind of post-production. If I were to do this differently, I would do a couple things. Number one, I would have used half a pumpkin. A whole pumpkin, even a small pumpkin, is a lot of pumpkin. I probably would have used less eggs. So I used 10 eggs. I used 500 grams of eggs. I would probably use 400 grams or 350 grams. And I looked online for like pumpkin pie recipes, and they're using for a 15-ounce can of pumpkin 3 eggs. So this is very eggy, and it tasted very eggy. I would also probably cut the temperature down and cook it more like a cheesecake or like a custard tart, where it's a lower temperature for longer, and that would avoid the darkness around the outside and probably avoid the cracking. It would probably take 2 hours easily to cook at 325, right? So I would probably do that. I would probably add more brandy because I can't really taste the brandy at all. I don't know that it added anything to the taste. But other than that, I think it turned out pretty good, and I'm really pleased with it.
Post-production Christy here. I just wanted to give you an update on the pudding and some other things I would do differently now that we've started eating it. I still think it's delicious, but it is definitely more eggy than modern pumpkin pie. It was not a smooth, creamy consistency, but with all those eggs, that's not surprising. It was overcooked, so if I were to stick with 350 degrees, I would have probably been able to take it out at the 60 or 70 minute mark rather than the 80 minute mark. And I want to add that I covered it loosely in foil after about 50 minutes, just to kind of keep the top from browning too much, which worked fairly well, but not super well. Second, I would have roasted the pumpkin to cook it rather than stew it. I think the roasting would have given it a really nice depth of flavor that you just don't get from stewing. And overall, with all that egg and the fact that it's not too sweet, it's more of a breakfast food than a dessert.
I hope you all enjoyed learning more about being a housewife in 1860s Philadelphia from the New Wife's Cookbooky thing. I really find all those different recipes for household ingredients and kind of what these women were supposed to do very interesting. I'm currently teaching a history of medieval and early modern women course, European women course. And one of the things that I'm trying to get my students to understand is that women were always working, and their labor wasn't always, they didn't get paid for it necessarily. They weren't always appreciated for what they were doing, but women were always working. And I'm hoping that by looking at this guide for new wives, that you're all seeing that that's the case too. That even very simple things like cleaning took actually a lot of work, because many women had to make their own cleaning products, and that takes time. And as someone who bakes my own bread and does a lot of cooking from scratch, these kind of historical cooking things, it takes a lot of time just to make bread in a modern kitchen once a week. I hope that you enjoyed it, and I hope that, and I know that I have more of an appreciation for these women, and I hope that you do as well. So with all of that, thank you all so much for joining me for episode 5 of Historical Baking out of the National Cookbook by Hannah Mary Bouvier Peterson. I don't have a plan for my next bake. I will look through this and see what I have and what I feel like baking. I'm glad that I got to do something slightly different, and I think that I would probably bake it again. I don't see why not. I mean, it's essentially pumpkin pie, right? It's eggs and pumpkin and sugar and spices and pumpkin, which is pretty normal. And it's that time of year. It is, I think, officially sweater weather here in Mississippi, although it could go back to not being sweater weather. It is Mississippi. So regardless, with all that being said, thank you all so much for joining me. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any comments, questions, or concerns or corrections, please, put them in the chat box below, and I'll address them as necessary. And as usual, I will put the original recipe as well as my conversion down below, and I'll put in exactly what I did. So if you make this and make some changes, I would love to see what you have. but I'm going to put in exactly what I have below. Oh, and if I make this again, I'll probably change what I did, and I'll report back like I did with the bread pudding that I made yesterday. Anyway, with all that being said, thanks so much for joining me. Have a good rest of your week. I will see you on Friday in my floss tube. And please take care of yourselves and have a good one.